all the other arguments for the existence of God that we're going to be looking at do more than simply try to get us to the conclusion that God exists by unpacking our concept of God, or by getting us to admit that it's at least possible that God exists. The one that we're going to turn to now is called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's an umbrella term for a wide range of different arguments that all fall along the same sort of line. We're going to be looking at only one or two of them. I think a good way into the cosmological argument is to recognize that most everything that we look at around us are contingent things. Now, contingency is an idea that's related to possibility and necessity. To say that something is contingent is to say that it exists, but it doesn't exist necessarily. It could not have existed. It seems that I'm a contingent being. I exist, but I could not have existed. There are possible worlds in which I don't exist. It seems true that the Earth itself is a contingent entity. The Earth exists, but it could not have. There are possible worlds in which the universe developed differently, and the Milky Way galaxy never showed up, let alone the planet Earth. All right, we can keep going further and further out, and now comes the following claim. It seems as though the cosmos itself, the whole thing, the universe writ large, is a contingent thing. It exists, but it could not have existed. So hold that thought in place. Now let's come back to ordinary contingent things. I exist, but I could not have. The Earth exists, but it could not have. Let's keep those together. Anything that's contingent, that exists but could not have, it seems, needs to have an explanation on why it exists rather than doesn't exist. I mean, after all, since it exists but could not have, surely there's an explanation on why it exists rather than not. The principle of sufficient reason is a philosophical principle that suggests that there is a reason or an explanation for every single fact that there is out there. And in particular, there's a reason or an explanation for why contingent things exist rather than don't exist. So on the one hand, we have a principle of sufficient reason that says that there's an explanation for everything, and in particular, there's an explanation for why contingent things exist rather than not. And on the other hand, we have a claim that says that the universe itself seems to be a contingent thing. It seems to be the sort of thing that could not have existed. Why is there something rather than nothing? Put these two things together and you get the main formula for the cosmological argument. The universe writ large is a contingent entity. It exists but could not have, and we need an explanation for why it exists rather than not existing. And now you get an argument for the existence of God, namely that God, the existence of a necessary being that created the contingent universe, is the explanation, the best explanation for the universe existing. Now, this is just one way of understanding the cosmological argument. There are lots of roads to the conclusion of the cosmological argument that God exists. Another has to do with cause, and this is a line of reasoning that many religious philosophers have followed and have used Aristotle and Aristotle's reasoning to get to this idea as well. So we talked about this in terms of the universe being a contingent thing, and there needing to be an explanation for the existence of contingent things. Why is there the existence of this contingent entity, the universe? And we appeal to the existence of a necessary being, God, to explain the creation of contingent things. I'm going to unpack that in a second. I just want to point to the idea that you can get there in a different way. One way of hearing the cosmological argument, or one way of understanding the cosmological argument, is by way of causation. So at any given moment, there are a wide range of events that have been caused by other events. Those other events were caused by events before them, and they were caused by events before them, and they were caused by events before them. You get this idea. Well, you can keep going back and back and back and back and back, and the thought is, the argument is, this can't go on forever. At some point, there has to be that thing, that first cause, the cause that gets all the other causes throughout time going. And that first cause is God. And so sometimes you will hear the philosophically inclined religious individuals refer to God as the first mover or the original cause, itself uncaused, but the source of all causation. If some of you who are religiously inclined out there are scratching your head at this point and going, this is not anything like the God that I recognize. The God that I recognize is a personal God, is a God that I pray to, that I appeal to. What are these abstractions? God as an unmoved mover, as a first cause? Well, there's a phrase in philosophy, the God of the philosophers, and yes, you should get used to this. As I said, we don't want to confuse the God of faith traditions from the God of the philosophers. They can sit next to each other. They often interrelate. Certainly it's the case that many theologians in a variety of different religious traditions have tried to use philosophy to help supplement faith in the divine, but in some sense these are distinct. Philosophers do view God abstractly as having these sets of properties that we've looked at, and as things like the unmoved mover, or as the first cause, or as the grounding, the necessarily existent being that grounds all contingency. And so for the rest of this module, I hope you can get used to these abstractions as describing God. The cosmological argument does have some interesting moves to offer it, but we also have some reason to push back on it. And throughout this module, I'm going to offer some arguments and I'm going to offer some rejoinders to get your own thinking going on these matters. So first, where can we begin? Well, notice that I made some quick jumps. I said I was a contingent being. I could have not existed. That seems very, very clear. It took an extraordinary, rare, unique set of circumstances to lead to me being created. The universe, the Earth, also, we have plenty of scientific models in which the Milky Way galaxy didn't exist, okay. But now when you make that leap to, and now the universe as a whole could not have existed, it's contingent too. Is that as obvious? Is it as obvious that the universe is contingent as it is that any particular planet is contingent, or any particular galaxy, or any particular, or going back down a little bit further, I'm going back closer to home a little bit, any particular solar system, any particular living entity, any particular non-living entity? It's quite a jump to go from the contingency of any of these things to the contingency of the universe itself. I am fairly agnostic about whether it's true of the universe as a whole that it could have not existed. And physics doesn't help us here. Physics all starts with, you hear some physicists say, we now have evidence of how something emerged from nothing. And when physicists say this, it sort of drives philosophers crazy, because when you unpack what physicists are talking about, there's not a nothing there that the universe originated from. They're talking about some basic original physical states from which physical reality emerged, but those basic physical states aren't nothing. They're something. Philosophers are asking whether the contingent universe as a whole, including those states, could have not existed. And I guess I have some intuition that, sure, maybe it's all contingent, but I equally am not particularly disturbed by the idea of the universe writ large as itself being a necessary thing. The nature of it, how it develops, how it unfolds, what it contains, that might be contingent, but it doesn't strike me as obvious that the universe itself is contingent rather than necessary, that some or other physical reality has always existed. So that's one thing. Second thing is, it's not at all clear that the principle of sufficient reason is true. Must every fact have an explanation? I don't know. We see in philosophy that the principle of sufficient reason ends up getting us committed to a whole bunch of weird things, and getting committed to a whole bunch of weird things may be too high of a cost. Maybe it suggests that the principle, there's something wrong with the principle. But even if there's nothing wrong with the principle, it's not entirely clear that positing the existence of a necessary being is satisfying the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, if I say the universe is contingent, it could have not existed, how do you explain that? And you say, God. And I say, well, how does God explain it? And you say, well, God exists necessarily. I could just as easily say, well, why does God exist necessarily? And if you say, well, that's just the way that God is, have you really just given me an explanation? Is that really an explanation? Or is that really just stating a certain fact? Here's where the explanation ends. This is just the nature of God. I can't explain why God has this nature. I'm just stipulating that God has this nature. You're allowed to do that, but that's not really explaining anything. And so it's not clear to me that positing the existence of a necessary being, a being that can't not exist, really explains the existence of contingent things, rather than just says, we're going to choose to have the explanation stop here. In the same vein, you don't need the necessarily existent being to be a god. It could just be the universe itself that's not a god that exists necessarily. Okay, so we have those concerns, and the similar concern comes with the causation story. We said, well, you can't just have causation going on forever. There must be a first cause. Must there be? Again, here's where I lose my grip, and maybe you have firmer intuitions. It's no more reasonable, from my perspective, to posit this thing, the first cause, itself uncaused, that got all causation going, as it is to just say causation goes on infinitely backwards. Both of those are hard to wrap one's head around, but I don't think one is less hard to wrap one's head around than the other is. On the one hand, I've got an uncaused cause. That's weird. On the other hand, I've got an infinite chain of causation going backwards. That's weird too. It's two weird things. But it's not clear that the God explanation, the uncaused cause, is better than just positing an infinite chain of causation.